Hello and welcome back to Today in the Word. We are in the midst of a Bible study on Paul's letters from prison, written by Dr. John Koessler, who joins me today. Today in the Word devotional is available to you free as an app. And we are deep diving today into a question that kind of comes out of this month's study. So the Apostle Paul underwent a dramatic life change from someone who opposed Christianity to someone who was struck by it and actually a fierce, person that was out and about proselytizing himself and calling people to Jesus. So this dramatic life change, and then he encounters a lot of opposition and spends time enduring persecution and even imprisonment. So we wanted to talk about the idea is why God allows this to happen. Why God wouldn't surround Paul and put him in a bubble and protect him. Why does Paul have to endure suffering? And I suppose, why do we sometimes have to endure suffering?
Yes, I think we have that question for the same reason. We think, well, we've come to Christ, we're trying to live for God. Things ought to be easier than they are for us. And when you ask the question, why does God allow us to suffer? Of course, entire volumes have been written, a library is full of books have been written on that subject. But I think in general that we have to understand two things about suffering. First, suffering entered human experience through Adam's sin. According to Romans 5:12, Paul says, sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way, death came to all people because all sinned. By choosing to allow the human race to continue after Adam's sin, God opts to work out his plan of redemption on a landscape that includes suffering. That's one of the reasons, a basic reason that we say, well, why do I have to suffer? The basic answer is because we live in a broken world. And
we all suffer.
Part of it. I think that's important because the second dimension to the suffering that Paul writes about that you might call mission related, which is something you emphasize, that it's a subset of the suffering that comes as a result of Adam's sin, because the suffering that Paul's experiencing is a result of opposition to God. Those who oppose Christ, those who oppose the message of the gospel, that grows out of what happens when sin enters human experience. We put ourselves against God. We become God's enemies. But so that really does mean that when we look at our own experience of suffering, it is possible to sort of separate it into these two kinds of categories. There is suffering that we experience that everybody suffers, whether they're a follower of Christ or not, just part of the human condition. And then there's also particular kinds of suffering that we experience because of our allegiance to Christ. Now, the good news for the Christian is that God draws all of that into his purpose for the one who belongs to Christ.
As the Christian, you look and Christ endured suffering also. And so we have plenty of examples of people who have endured physical and all types of suffering on behalf of following God, of doing what is right. I think one thing that has struck me as I've read through these letters is his attitude about life and suffering. And it's remarkably positive.
Yes, and I think that's important. That's one of the things that you really learn from Paul about our experience of suffering, that suffering is not an end in itself. He sees God has a hand in it, that when he suffers, God is still in control. God has a purpose in it for him personally, and God has a greater purpose for it in terms of his larger plan for the church. And Paul is drawn into that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think to me that was some of the biggest takeaways, that we aren't just to commiserate, but that there is actually a purpose, and that can reassure you in the midst of it. I loved his Philippians 1:2, where he says to live is Christ and to die is gain, right? So it takes away some of the fear of that, that Christ is in all of it for us.
He sees if he continues, which means continue into the opportunity to face opposition and to suffer, he sees that as being fruitful for ministry, which is also a good thing. It's win-win, which is really his lesson. Whatever situation you're in today, if you're in Christ, it's win-win.
I love that. I think we're going to end there because that's such an encouragement to remember that God is with us. The prayers of others are needed and appreciated as we walk through difficult times. But it's a win-win because we are with him either way. So thank you, John.
All right, thank you.
And thank you for joining us once again. If you like these videos, please like them and subscribe to our channel, and maybe even share this with others or someone who's walking through a time that could use this encouragement. Thank you.